In this class, we will be discussing the features of the regional sultanates during the period of Delhi Sultanate. Between the 14th and 16th century, the regional sultanates grew up, and how they responded to the challenges of amalgamating different features and growing a totally new idiom. This we will be dealing with in this class. While discussing the history of architecture, the historians, they have sensitized themselves to the fact that the history of architecture also is a complex socio-administrative history, because at one point you have to collect money, collect funds for building the architecture, and the architecture itself communicated some ideas which the patrons wanted to say to the spectators. It is a kind of socio-political exercise, administrative exercise, and in this context I will just very briefly narrate how the regional level politics was going on at the 13th century in the Delhi Sultanate. As you know that after its inception till the period of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, we can say that Delhi Sultanate, it encompassed a large part of the Indian subcontinent, particularly the northern India, but from Alauddin Khalji himself, Delhi Sultanate had started to expand in Deccan first and then in the deep south, and Muhammad bin Tughlaq led this process to the culmination, from where the necessity arose that he should shift his capital from Delhi to Daulatabad. So Delhi was becoming a pan-Indian phenomena. But in the period of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, we find that the forces of disintegration also has started to work. As you know that Taimur came to India, wrought havoc, and the Tughlaq dynasty, who was at the throne of Delhi, was at the receiving end, and after his departure, the total edifice built by the Tughlaq dynasty, which was almost in shambles by then, it totally collapsed. And taking the benefit of this political uncertainty, you find that regional level sultanates developing. First it was the Jaunpur Sultanate. It was known as the Sharqi Sultanate because the younger son of Firoz Tughlaq, he conferred a title to the regional governor as Sultanush Sharq, which means the ruler of East. But it lasted only for a century, because ultimately it was during the period of Sikandar Lodi that it was finally again brought under the tutelage of Delhi Sultanate. Bengal never ever from its inception during the period of Ikhtiaruddin Muhammad bin Bakhtiyar Khalji in the early part of the 13th century, never it became totally enmeshed with, totally integrated with the Delhi Sultanate. Regional level banner of independence was unfurled, and this got its culminating point when Shamsuddin Ilyas Shah in the first half of the 14th century established a totally new regional level sultanate. Then you have the development of Malwa Sultanate again by the end of the 14th century. It unfurled its banner of independence. Then in Gujarat, though the person who was entrusted with the responsibility of ruling Gujarat, and he was the father-in-law of Firoz Tughlaq, we find that finally there also a new regional sultanate developed under Ahmad Shah the First. In his name only the city of Ahmedabad was established. He established the new city. And then in Deccan, you have the examples of Bahmani Sultanate, which later disintegrated into 5 segments, and Vijayanagar Empire, it stays. So we can say that from the early part of 14th century onwards, we find the development of regional sultanates. Now, almost all of the regional powers that was developing in this period, they were all Muslim sultanates. In Bengal, Jaunpur, Malwa, Gujarat, Bahmani, all of them can be considered to be the reflection of the Muslim sultanates that were developing, barring the exception of Vijayanagar and also of Rajasthan, because in Rajasthan, centering Mewar, you find development of a new state.
Excuse me, sir, what are then the features of the Islamic architecture?
Architecturally, according to the ground plan or the different features of the necessities of religion, the Indic Hindu religion and the necessities of Islamic religion, it is totally different. In Islamic architecture, there is the pulpit from where the sermon is being given, and the place where the people offer prayer. The central nave of a mosque, it comprises of two parts. One, mirzab, and another is the mimbar. Apart from this, there is the place, as I told you, where the people are offering, propitiating to the god. This is actually an open space. In some of the cases, we find that the central nave is then divided into, or the total mosque, it is then divided into aisles, and which is then segregated into several bays, where there are rows in which the people sitting on their knee offer propitiate in front of the god. Apart from this, there should be, or there in many places like Qutub Minar, it is basically a tower from where the muezzin, they are giving calls for the faithful to assemble in the congregation. Keeping these two features together, one, development of regional sultanates and the necessities of the Islamic religion, we find that in different parts, different types of idioms they are developing. The difference is because of the local features which are then being assembled. In Bengal, as I told you, that with the establishment of the Ilyas Shahi dynasty, we have the extant religious architectures being built. The first example can be taken up as the Adina Mosque, which developed in Pandua. There we find a huge oblong structure being built, where there is a central nave which is then balanced by two transepts on both sides, and on the central nave you have a dome. Adina Mosque, the extant building that we find now, it is a huge building, the largest in India, and it can be compared with the great mosque in Damascus. Now, in Bengal, if we discuss the basic features of the Islamic architecture, we find that either it is the oblong structure or it is a square structure on which there is a dome. Gunawant Mosque can be considered to be one. And then we have the permutations of these two things, where there is the central nave, along with which we find the aisles and the bays. They are being domed by semi-hemispherical structures, the domes. One of the best example can be the Chotoshona Masjid, or a larger one which was known as the Bodoshona Masjid, both in gold. To hold a big dome, you should have a cylindrical base on which the huge dome can be built, which is generally associated with the Islamic architecture, that there should be there are huge bulbous domes which adorn many of the mosques or mausoleums, like for instance in Delhi, the Jami Masjid, or you go to Taj Mahal, you find a huge bulbous dome. This can be held only when there is a strong cylindrical base, but in Bengal this cylindrical base was absent, and that's why the domes, they were short in nature and they don't give the appearance of that huge, stupendous structure. This is one of the weakness, barring a few exceptions, like in Gaud you find the Lotan Masjid. It was built, the popular imagination associates it with a very beautiful dancer in the court, and in her name the masjid was built. In Lotan Masjid the structure has almost collapsed, but from the remains we find that there was a huge dome based on that cylindrical base. But this also should be kept in mind that the facade, the front view, it was embellished with the glazed tiles which generally broke the monotony. In front, in Lotan Masjid, the use of the blue glazed tiles, it is a bit gaudy in its nature, but much more successful use of, much more soothing use of this kind of tiles are found in other places. Also, the gateway, they were richly embellished, as in the case of Tatipada Mosque, with terracotta carvings. This gives a soothing appearance to many of the constructions that we find in Bengal under the Sultanate. One of the best examples, one of the notable examples of the architectural norms in Jaunpur is the Atala Masjid. The use of these materials earlier used in the temples, particularly in the innermost part of the mosque, in the central nave, it gives a distinctive feature of to this mosque. Apart from this aspect, another very important notable feature is the huge propylon which actually faces the central nave at the outset. It is a facade which distinguishes the mosque, the innermost chamber, from outside. This propylon, it was slowly tapering when it went up, and this structure, it resembled with a huge triumphal arch generally built by the sultans, which was then pierced by, at every tier it was pierced by small gateways. The central gateway is a bit bigger. Apart from the central gateway, there are several breakings, niches piercing the facade, which gives light to the inner courtyard also. And this structure is just in front of the central dome. This can be considered to be a weakness, that the general balance of the architecture, the propriety of the architecture, it loses balance. And this does not give preponderance to the facade or the dome. Both are subdued because of this very closeness of the two structures. The Jami Masjid, which was built in Jaunpur in 1470, this also demonstrates the same strength and weakness of the Jaunpur architectural norms. Here we can say at one point that the rapprochement, bringing together of the Hindu and the Islamic architectural norms, succeeded to some extent in Jaunpur. In the case of Malwa, we find that, as I told you, a regional sultanate, it grew up at the very fag end of the 14th century, with the army of Timur going back and the Tughlaq dynasty faltering, crumbling under the pressure of the invasion. We find that development of Malwa Sultanate came up. The Malwa Sultanate was very active, particularly the second ruler, Hosank Shah. He was very active, both politically, fighting wars with the neighboring sultans, particularly of Gujarat, as well as architecturally, because huge architectures, huge monuments were built by the sultans, almost concentrated wholly in the fort city of Mandu, which overlooks the plateau region in the Vindhyas, and here they have built several architectural monuments, both of religious nature as well as of secular nature. For instance, the Jami Masjid. You have within the pulpit the canopied mimbar. It resembles that of sculptural manifestations of a temple. So here also you find that the Hindu architectural norms being assimilated with. Apart from the religious architectures, Mandu is also famous for the legends like Baj Bahadur Rupmati, or the architectural or the monuments like the Hindola Palace or the Jahaz Mahal. Now, the Hindola Mahal, it was basically a darbar hall. It had very thick battlements, very thick base, but it had a very pronounced tapering, giving it a kind of optical illusion which seemed that the mahal is swaying. That's why the peculiar name Hindola, which means a swinging palace. Then we have another very important structure which was known as Jahaz Mahal, which overlooked two big lakes, and this was basically secular architecture which was built by the Sultan for bathing. Structure wise, this can be considered to be innovative approach, because it is almost 370 feet long, whereas the depth is only 50 feet. So it is a kind of elongated structure where there are steps which leads to the bathing locations. Then you have another very important structure, mausoleum, built for Hosang Shah. This is a mausoleum which was built on a elevated base, on which the outside facade is built by white marble. On the four corners you have cupolas, and it is dominated by a huge bulbous dome. Together you can say that this gives a very soothing appearance, a huge pile which has its somber presence in front of us. There are some other structures in Mandu like the Baz Bahadur's palace or the Rupmati's pavilion, which are much more embellished by the popular imagination, but architecturally they are not that very important. In Gujarat, from very early part, we find that development of architecture, and where the elements of the Islamic architectural norms and the Indic Hindu architectural norms blended much more successfully. For instance, in Dholka, you find that Hilal Khan Qazi's mosque was there. The appearance itself tells us that it was basically a kind of temple which is in front of us. Only the exception is the dome, which is the typical feature of the emblematic presence of Islam. In other places like Ahmad Shah's mosque or the Jami mosque, these have a fine blend between the Indian Hindu architectural norms and the Islamic architectural norms. Then you have the presence of Teen Darwaza, where it is a kind of gateway which is having three arcs, of which the central gateway is a bit wide, but it is very finely balanced with battlements on the top, and this also gives a very nice appearance. One of the finest examples of the architecture in Ahmedabad is Rani Sipudi's tomb. Here, the crenulated structure or the perforated window ceilings, this gives a very nice appearance in the eyes of the spectators. Another important feature of the Gujarat architectural norm is the slender minars on both sides of the gateways that you find in the mosque of Achyut Kuki or Mahfiz Khan. The front view itself gives us the idea. And then you have the screens, very exquisite carving of the screens as found in the Sidi Said's mosque in Ahmedabad. Here, there was a fine blending of the Iranian elements with the Indian elements. For instance, Chand Minar, the gateway, and the nice tile works with the writings from Quran given in front. This gives the appearance of a typical Iranian architecture in front of us. There also you find a fine blending between the Indian Hindu elements and the Islamic elements. One of the best examples can be the elephant stable in Hampi, which is the capital of Vijayanagar. Then in the Lotus Mahal also you find a fine blending of the Indian and the Islamic elements. Now, what are these Indian and the Islamic elements? The distinctive feature of the Indian element can be considered to be the trabate technique, because though Indians knew about building of the true arches, it was seldom used. And before the advent of Islam, concrete and mortar was seldom used. Mostly they were of huge stone structures. So in the Indian technique, it was predominantly the trabate technique, whereas in the Islamic architecture, it was the arcuate technique. Building of arc was the distinctive feature of Islamic architecture. Now in Gujarat and in other parts, you find that in some cases these two techniques were finely blended. The best example was in the case of Gujarat, and Gujarat is important because the Gujarat architectural norms influenced heavily the Mughal architecture which developed during the period of Akbar.
How far the Hindu styles of temple building got fused with the Islamic structures?
Number one, the ruins of the sacked temples, they were being assimilated for building of mosques. One example can be the case of Qubbatul Islam or Quwatul Islam in the Qutub complex. The same case can be found in the case of Dhai Din Ka Jhopda in Ajmer. When they were using the material, this gave a distinctive feature to the Islamic architecture, which is generally austere in its nature, but with carved columns being used. This gave a distinctive feature. This is at the very beginning. But we also should keep in mind that in most of the cases, when they were building mosques in a great haste, because they don't have any place for prayer, so they have to build it as fast as possible, there was no chance of bringing architects from outside, from the Central Asia, and employ them for building of new mosques. So local artisans, they were being employed, and naturally when they come with their own sensibilities, with their own tradition. In this manner, you find that when you are employing the local artisans, naturally a kind of change takes place, a very subtle type of change takes place, and with these coming together, you find a distinct idiom of Indo-Islamic architecture developing in different parts of India.